morning, and then 20 minutes I haul you off. Okay, and
just going to make a couple of announcements too at the beginning, if that's okay. So what I'd like to do is have Thomas and Gina talk about the social media, which people have been twittering about until today, and then something on CME credits. Just reminding people about filling out the online forms.
okay.
And about the PGS meeting.
Okay, people decide that they will have the PGS meeting starting at 6.
Yeah.
So, and where's the Northern Spy room?
I don't know where it is. I'm assuming it's down that way, but yeah, I'm afraid I don't know.
Okay. So, but we'll do it. Tell people to start grab some hors d'oeuvres. We'll then have our annual meeting, and then people can come back for the music.
Okay, so this time I think we're going to try to get to things a bit more on time, because some people have some evening plans and flights to catch and things like that. So if people can start to take their seats, that would be good. I also will need Gina and Thomas up here in a second. So I'm going to wait for a couple of people to come from outside. No, you can't. That's when. Yeah. So, yeah, I'll do that in a second. Once Gina's also here, then. I don't know where she is. It's not. Yeah. Okay. So, I guess I wanted to remind people of a few things. One is in terms of continuing education credits that people can still get at the desk after they've finished their final day here. We want to make sure that everybody is filling out their evaluations, and I think that we have a bit of a shortage of paper evaluations right now, but we were hoping that people would be doing this online. So off of the website, I showed how to do that this morning. So please do fill in your online evaluations of the sessions and then also of the conference as a whole. We have a couple of meetings this evening. Well, one major meeting, a Physicians for Global Survival meeting. That's in your program, and they have told me that everybody is welcome. They especially welcome students and residents and non-medical students too, and any other health professional. So it's open to everybody. We have Jenny and Joey and Chris Brown singing tonight, so Joey just came now, and so that should be a really nice time for all of us. Finally, I wanted to mention about social media. So we've got Thomas and Gina who've been following and will tell us if they posted any pictures with the brown guy on Instagram or... Go ahead.
Sure.
Lots of those and lots of retweets of those pictures. They're popular. No.
Very popular.
So, yep, we've been tweeting lots, and I think a number of the conference participants have been too. I know that the next set of panelists are all very active on Twitter. So I think at least most of them. But if you do want to use Twitter, the hashtag we had projected earlier is PEGASUSConf, C-O-N-F. And feel free to ask any questions. I'm sure that we can facilitate answering them or addressing the panelists with questions posed over Twitter.
And I think that Twitter is also a great way to keep in touch with the conversation going on. I know there's a lot of concurrent sessions, so if you don't want to miss anything, follow us on Twitter at PEGASUSConf, just like the hashtag. And it's a good way to kind of see what's going on in the different workshops and symposia you weren't able to attend, and follow up with people afterwards, because you can only be in one place at one time, unfortunately.
Good. Okay, thanks everyone. Look forward to this panel.
Thanks, everyone.
Hand it over to Richard.
Shalom, peace, scano, bonjour, ciao, mujo, sego, buenos tardes, and welcome. So there you have it in writing. Here we have the quintessential moment. The crowd gathers on a frozen pond for a talk on advocacy. So you've heard that dirty word already this morning, and this whole session is going to be about three great advocates who will be speaking to you this afternoon. What I'll do is I'll introduce them all. They'll speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have questions at the end. One of the things, two of the speakers here are doctors, medical doctors, and doctors wear many hats, which have been listed by the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons as the CAN-MEDs. And one of those roles is advocacy. We've also talked about social determinants of health, and one of our speakers, Ryan Meili, gave a TED Talk on improving lives in society, and talked about the social determinants of health. And we've certainly talked about the most important one, which is poverty. Back in my day, before social determinants of health, we talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so again, peace is probably down in one sense, at the bottom. You have to have stability before you go off and do your missionary work or whatever, medical work, etc. Overseas. People need to have food in their stomach, need to have a roof over their head, or need to be secure before you can move up to the other hierarchy. Again, back in medical school, we learned about cells, and what we have now found with epigenetics is that poverty can now affect your telomeres on your chromosomes and shorten them. Cellular biology is important, but you can work your way on up onto the patient. And then about 50 years ago, family medicine came into being, and we enlarged that to talk about the patient in the context of the family. And now we're talking about ecosystem health to encompass all of the environment, the community, and society in general. So thus we need to look at advocacy, to look at it in terms of social determinants of health, to look at it in terms of creating stability, of peace, and also going up to looking at the whole environment. So we have three people. We've got, as I said, two are doctors. Meb is going to talk about refugees over there who are coming over here. Ryan is our politician from Saskatchewan, and Erica is a friend also from Saskatchewan. And I think you prefer to be called a student, but all three are really activists. So there's all of Meb's qualifications, and the quote at the bottom is not his, but something that he feels is important, and you can comment about that further. Ryan, as I said, gave a TED Talk. He's run as a politician and is now will also be speaking about thinking upstream. And basically, this is the idea of you see a stream coming down, and down comes someone who's almost drowning, and in runs Ryan and rescues him. And then he no sooner gets that person on shore when another person comes on downstream, and Ryan jumps in and rescues that person. And then he wonders, where are all these people coming from? Hence, going upstream to find out the problem. Again, it's sort of the old adage, it's hard to remember that your purpose is to drain the swamp when you're up to your waist in alligators. And then Erica is our student, and she's going to speak on Idle No More. So with that, I'll call on Meb to start things off.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm just going to start by looking for my presentation. Oh, there we are. Okay. So I'm going to start by reminding you of an event that happened in a not so distant past here in Canada. It was the late 1970s when there were incursions by China into North Vietnam, and in response, the Vietnamese government took the opportunity to expel all ethnic Chinese. In the confusion that ensued, a lot of people took the opportunity to try to leave Vietnam. There was also strife going on in Cambodia and Laos. There were 2 million people moving in Southeast Asia. And although the vast majority of them moved overland, the issue really came to the attention of the West when we started seeing pictures like this. Boatloads of mostly Vietnamese migrants in shark-infested waters in the South China Sea. The Canadian government at that time, I think in a very generous fashion, put out a call to ordinary Canadians. And they said, you know what, for every refugee that Canadians sponsor, the government will match it. Well, within 2 years, 40,000, mostly Vietnamese refugees, were sponsored by ordinary Canadians to come to Canada. The government saw those numbers and, of course, tried to back off. They said they would sponsor 10, were shamed into sponsoring 20,000. So 60,000, mostly Vietnamese refugees, ended up coming to Canada in the early 1980s. And I use this as an example to start with really for two reasons. First, I still believe this is the best studied refugee migration in Canadian history. And this is really through the work of Dr. Morley Beiser, who was working in British Columbia at that time. And he actually has some very interesting data. He followed people out 10 years. And what did he find? He found that after 10 years, the rates of employment in this mostly Vietnamese group were actually higher than in people who were Canadian born. And he found the rates of mental health issues were actually lower. And I think this isn't inconsistent with what many of us are seeing out there, is that people need help when they arrive, but if you give them long enough, they actually do very well here. The second reason I bring this up is because it was about 3 years ago when this tin can floated across the ocean carrying Sri Lankan migrants and landed off the coast of British Columbia, and how times have changed, because 40 years later, we didn't talk about a compassionate response to this group. Matter of fact, we put them all in detention, and apparently there were discussions about actually turning this boat away in international waters. Times have changed. I want to start by just reviewing for you. I mean, my talk is about refugee health, and as was mentioned in the workshop we did a little bit earlier, there's a lot of misconceptions about what it means to be a refugee. So really, being a refugee means that you adhere to a very formal definition. It's a legal definition that's mandated in a document that was developed in 1951 by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. And inherent in that definition are really three things. One, you have to be fleeing persecution. That persecution has to be based on one of five things. So it has to be based on race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion. And you have to be outside your country of origin. And the reason I put this out there is often there's labeling of people who are here who failed their refugee claim as being bogus refugees, or sort of the portrayal of people trying to cheat the system. I've been privileged enough to see thousands of people arrive in Canada over the last 10 years through the refugee stream. And although many of them are not accepted as refugees, it doesn't necessarily mean they're not fleeing something. So if your children are hungry, if your town has been ravaged by hurricane or earthquake, it might not make you a refugee, but I think it's a bit misleading to suggest that these people aren't fleeing something that many of us would find horrendous. When we look at what's happening in terms of refugee numbers across the world, I just want to share these stats with you. This is from 2013, numbers just released. And overall, we've seen a 28% increase in asylum seekers across the world in 2012, that is. And as you go down the list, it's hard for me to see this, but in Europe, there's a 33% increase. We see it in Nordic countries. Even in individual countries, you'll see in Australia, the numbers were up 50%, Japan, 27%. Korea and Japan, there's not a lot of refugee claimants that go there, but the numbers are up. And the Americans saw a 25% increase. France, a 10% increase. Canada, we saw a 50% decrease in refugee claimants last year. I mean, incredibly startling, and certainly goes against the grain of what we're seeing in other parts of the world. Now, just to show this to you in a different format, these are the top 10 refugee claimant receiving countries. And you can see Germany, United States, France, Sweden, Turkey, the UK, Italy, Australia. Switzerland, the numbers went down. The green bar is 2012 and the blue bar is 2013. Almost all of these countries are seeing an increase in claimants. When we look at what's happening in Canada, not only are we seeing less claimants, and I mean it's dropping like a stone, we are seeing the lowest numbers we've seen since numbers have been kept in 1989. So we almost always have had over 20,000 claimants coming to Canada. You can see last year we were just under 10,000. Not only are we seeing less people, but the acceptance rate is at an all-time low. So if you take a look here, you can see in the last 4 or 5 years we've been well under 40%, which again puts us at historical lows. Some people argue that, sure, we're not seeing as many refugee claimants, but we're taking more resettled refugees, people Canada chooses to come. And unfortunately, that is not the case. When we look at these numbers, and this represents people that Canada has identified being people in need of protection, they're either sponsored by the federal government or by private groups, much as the Vietnamese were 40 years ago. You'll see the numbers are also at historical lows. Okay, so what has been the government's response? For many of us, we lament these changes. The new Minister of Citizenship and Immigration Canada, when these numbers came out earlier this year, actually said we've achieved great results in making the refugee system work for refugees and for tax-paying Canadians. In a similar article, he talks about the overall reduction in asylum claimants has already resulted in greater than anticipated savings to Canadian taxpayers of more than $600 million. Not able to describe how they get to that number despite the number of requests. And I guess, by that hypothesis, if you extrapolate to having zero refugee claimants, the savings would be even higher. So why the decrease? We know that the number of people seeking protection are an all-time high. Why not Canada? Well, I think in my mind there's a few reasons for that. First, there's been a change to refugee protection laws here. We know that the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration Canada now has the opportunity to designate groups as being put into a particular category where they can be put in detention for up to a year with just one review. We know that certain people who are designated as coming from specific countries are now put into a different tier in terms of refugee processing. We know there's been changes to refugee health insurance, and we'll talk about that a bit further. I would argue there's generally been a change in the tone and culture that we have towards accepting refugees. Canada is no longer seen as a place that's welcoming to people fleeing protection. And we see this in the banter of government ministers. The consistent and repetitive notion that people are here cheating the system, are taking advantage of our healthcare and social service system. And I think that message has gotten out there, that if you have the opportunity, Canada is no longer the place you're going to be going to. Okay, I want to spend some time talking about health insurance for refugees. So, just to give you a bit of a background, the federal government has had a system in place since 1957 of providing health insurance coverage to refugees and refugee claimants coming to Canada. I don't want to get into the details because it's incredibly complex, but just to say For most of us that are clinicians, it was fairly straightforward. People would get access to physicians' diagnostics and laboratory tests, very much like we get through our provincial health plans, OHIP here in Ontario. And they would get access to medications, prosthetics, emergency dental and vision care, just like people would get on social assistance. Historically, refugees and refugee claimants were getting exactly the same care that low-income Canadians were getting. All right? And that's the way it stood until April of 2012. And at that point, the federal government announced dramatic cuts to the interim federal health program. All refugees were supposed to lose access to federal coverage for medications, emergency dental, optometry service, assisted device, and prosthetics. Now, on the Friday before the long weekend when the cuts were to go into effect, very quietly, the minister had an interview on CBC in the late afternoon suggesting that one particular group of refugees, government-assisted refugees, were never intended to be on that the list of cuts, and the website changed that evening. Unfortunately, they were actually mailed documents that told them they were going to lose health insurance. There was one very well-documented case of a child who had epilepsy, whose parents couldn't afford the seizure medications. They were under the impression that they were no longer going to have coverage for it. They stopped the medication, and the child ended up in hospital with seizures. Some refugees have lost coverage for essentially all health insurance, including emergency care. So, what should be the response? I'll tell you, when the cuts were first announced, I still remember it was a Wednesday afternoon, and I thought, you know, there's a few of us across the country who are going to, or across the province, who are going to be dealing with this in a big way, and some of our colleagues across the country. The next day I got a phone call. I'd sent out an email on that Wednesday afternoon. I got a phone call from Dr. Philip Berger. Some of you might know him. He's a physician at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. And I think he wouldn't mind me saying he's been an advocate or kicking up a fuss for many years about many different issues. I didn't know Philip very well at that time, but he called me and he said, Meb, I've got an idea. I said, what's that? And he said, well, it worked in the 1970s. I said, okay, good. I said, well, what is it, Philip? He said, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go occupy a federal government building. I said, right, who is this? And the more we thought about it, the more we realized the government had made that announcement. There really had been no reaction to it. It's a small group of folks out there. If we could put this issue into the public domain, we were very confident that Canadians would find this objectionable. All right? So this is what happened. Can you run that video for us?
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. I refer to also the
Stand up. Well, it seems fairly extraordinary to me that on behalf of the minister, you would not arrange a meeting not only with his constituents, but with physicians, many of whom are from different disciplines across the city, to discuss serious concerns. There's a proposition by the government right now that's going to deny many refugees coming here, some from camps directly, medications like insulin for diabetes. And if you look at this policy, it's really quite fantastic. Maybe I'll show it to you because you're not familiar with it. I mean, just listen to this. There's scenarios the federal government puts out. This is from Citizen Immigration Canada, so I'm not making up the document. And then for refugee claimants from countries not designated as refugee producing or rejected refugee claimants, there's sections here called medical emergency. Listen to this, doctors. Medical emergency dash heart attack. Then it says coverage provided based on client status. For heart attack, none. None for heart attack. How can that be in Canada in an official document? The federal government puts out a document that says for people having heart attacks, it's not going to provide medical coverage for them, or insulin for diabetics. If you can't come today, we'd appreciate a meeting. Maybe you could phone in. We can deliver our message to him, and then the meeting would be over. But you're not even going to permit a meeting to happen. So it's a bit frustrating for us.
Okay, doctors, you're going to have to go outside. The member of parliament's not here. So I've spoken to one of the organizers outside. It's okay to protest on the sidewalk, but inside the office, once the person wants you outside, you have to go outside, okay?
Can I just mention, as a constituent, I'm disappointed that my MP has a policy that you won't, to instruct you not to contact him when I'm here to speak with him. I think that it's very, as a constituent, to discover that I can't ask you, that he won't take a phone call for you to let him know what's happening is very disappointing.
I appreciate that.
We do have a letter that we're going to leave with you on behalf of the organizing committee, on behalf of all of us, that you can deliver to Mr. Oliver with a contact phone number to arrange a follow-up meeting. Here it is.
Will you commit to delivering it to Mr. Oliver?
I will deliver to him.
No, I think we're okay.
We have friends now and colleagues in Ottawa
fine.
who are marching on Parliament Hill as we speak. Just got a text.
All right. So I think, there's people older than me who suggest that they've never seen this type of response from the healthcare community around any issue, including Medicare. It's really been quite startling. There's been editorials in medical journals. We've got a national surveillance system in place. There's been 20 national healthcare organizations that have actually come out against these cuts. And when you look at these bodies, these are groups like the Canadian Medical Association, the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons, the College of Family Physicians, the Canadian Nursing Association, national groups that represent dentists, optometrists, social workers. I think it's fair to say if you are a healthcare worker in this country, it's very likely that your national healthcare organizations have come out with public statements against these cuts. And when you look at the language that they're using, this was from a letter that was sent by 8 national organizations, including the CMA and the Royal Colleges and the Canadian Nurses Association. It says quite clearly, your press release of April 25th, when the cuts were first announced, suggests the cancellation of supplemental health benefits will save money. Very clearly, they state this is not the case. Second, by failing to provide upfront health services, there's a risk of undiagnosed and untreated health problems resulting in an increase in both medical complications and future healthcare costs. These changes in coverage will have deleterious effects to the public health and safety of all Canadians. We as healthcare providers are asking you to revise or rescind this policy announcement. This is very strong language from organizations like the CMA, who have not generally been considered to be by any means radical. At one point, Minister Kenney actually called us militant leftists. And that was his response to a court challenge we had against him. And it was very interesting that a College of Family Physicians tweeted a couple of days later, we at the college have never considered ourselves to be militant leftists, right? The outrage hasn't been confined to healthcare workers. So this is an article in The Guardian, which actually followed up that little event at Joe Oliver's office. We've seen editorials in major newspapers. This is one from the Globe and Mail, why cutting healthcare for asylum seekers makes no sense. Sorry. This is the Hamilton Spectator. Refugee health cuts are bad for all of us. Winnipeg Free Press. They aren't all bogus refugees as portrayed by Kenny. An editorial in the Toronto Star. There's Philip with her high-tech megaphone. Refugee healthcare cuts threaten everybody's access. Chopping healthcare coverage for refugees is a false saving, again from the Toronto Star. It's not just the centrist or left or center newspapers. This is an editorial in the National Post. Kenny dropped the ball. Immigration minister needs to clarify its healthcare coverage. This is an article or an editorial in the Toronto Sun. Kenny's main bill hurts refugees and Canada's reputation. Faith-based groups. So the Catholic Health Alliance, which represents 120 large healthcare institutions in this country, including St. Michael's Hospital and St. Joseph's Health Centre here in Toronto, came out with a statement. The Toronto Board of Rabbis has come out with a very strong statement. So, artists. So there was a letter signed by 50 artists, including people like Margaret Atwood, Michael Ondaatje, Vincent Lam, a physician who works at Toronto East General Hospital, have come out with a statement. There's been editorials. Neil Area led on an editorial in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, and the editors themselves at the CMAJ produced an editorial earlier this year. Why such a dramatic response? Well, I think part of it is that the policy is so inherently flawed. We have organizations like the Ontario Medical Association that have come out strongly against this. And regardless of where you stand on the political spectrum, it's easy to see why denying people health care is costly. It's, not only is it inhumane, but it's just poor policy. I think for many of us, we'd like to think that in Canada, targeting the most vulnerable is something that we find quite objectionable. And when we're talking about refugee families and refugee kids who've arrived here, sometimes being exposed to horrible trauma, having them arrive here not having health insurance, I think, you know, for many of us as Canadians, we find that absolutely abhorrent. There's been tremendous leadership around this issue. I'm going to talk about Phil Berger at St. Michael's Hospital, but our national colleges have really stepped up and provided a strong voice, and I think given a bit of cover for those of us that are doing advocacy on the ground. And finally, I think those of us that work in healthcare find it quite objectionable that healthcare would be used as a leverage for an immigration policy. We can argue about the merits of Canada's refugee policy, and I might have some strong feelings about it, but the notion of denying people health care to deter them from coming to Canada is something I think as healthcare workers we should all be quite concerned about. Finally, I'll make a quick plug. We're having our third National Day of Action. We've nailed down 16 cities across the country where there will be public protests. Again, what we're trying to do is just keep this issue alive in the media and in a public forum. The event here in Toronto will happen on Victoria Street on June 16th. Come, send people, bring your neighbors, friends, families, whatever it is. It is really important we have numbers. There's another event happening in Hamilton. I think Kitchener has signed on as well. So if you can free up that time, we'd greatly appreciate it. Finally, I want to leave you with a quote, and this is from Meili, who's a Nobel Prize-winning author, where he said, "Today as yesterday, a nation is judged by its attitude towards refugees." I think all of us should be quite concerned that Canada's attitude towards refugees is changing dramatically. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Meb. I think you've just seen advocacy being demonstrated. So thank you very much. Our next speaker is Ryan Meili, and he's just written this book, A Healthy Society, and at 6 o'clock outside, he will be autographing it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you, everyone. It's such an honor to be on stage with these two. These are two people that I admire very much, I think as individuals, but also as the movements that they represent. Meb, I'm from Saskatchewan, so our version of doctors taking to the streets was 50 years ago to fight against Medicare. So it's been such an amazing thing to see doctors taking to the streets fighting for care for everyone. That's pretty moving. And Erica, interestingly enough, has a connection to that movement as well. We first met not long after I got a very unpleasant letter in the mail from my MP. Her name's Kelly Block, and she sent out an appeal saying, or a letter to all of her constituents saying that refugees used to get all kinds of great health care, not anymore. And this seemed to be something that she was happy about. They were proud of this. And so we ended up, actually my wife, who's a pediatrician and also an advocate, she organizes the Days of Action in Saskatoon, wound up on the front page of the paper, and Erica got in touch with us and organized a big protest rally outside Kelly Block's office with lots of medical students and doctors and people from the community objecting to that division that was being sown from her office. And it was only 2 or 3 weeks later that we found ourselves on the streets together again, marching in one of the very first I Don't Know More rallies right in my neighborhood, in the core neighborhoods of Saskatoon. And just to see the way that that movement has brought together tens of thousands of people, Indigenous and non, to fight for Indigenous rights, and the ongoing work that is coming out of I Don't Know More, it's deeply inspiring. I want to talk a little bit just to who's this guy up on stage. So I want to spend a little bit of time around the campfire and get to know you, tell you a little bit about myself. I am a farm boy from southern Saskatchewan, not far from Moose Jaw is where I grew up. And somewhere along the lines, I got bit by a social justice bug and decided that I would go into medicine. It took the College of Medicine a little longer to convince than it took me. And along the way, I got to have some great experiences working in countries in the developing world, particularly in South America. And those experiences greatly informed my eventual practice and also the types of things that I looked for in my learning during medical training. Today I'm a family doctor in an inner city clinic, West Side Clinic in Saskatoon. I also work half my time as the chair or head of the Division of Social Accountability for our Faculty of Medicine. And among other things, one of the projects that I'm involved in is something called Making the Links. And Making the Links, I sometimes joke that it's medical school the way I wished it had been. We take 10 students a year and we expose them to what we think are the basic skills they need to start a career working in global health. They do training in classroom, Global Health 1, that's big picture, determinants of health, large concepts of global health, and then Global Health 2 that really focuses in on clinical practice in remote settings. And we don't just stick to that traditional idea of global health as somewhere else. We start really close to home. Right across the river from the medical school is the first place at Switch, a student-run clinic run by students from medicine, nursing, pharmacy, nutrition, clinical psychology, physiotherapy, all of the health sciences, and really all the university. Students can participate offering after-hours services, both direct clinical services under supervision, as well as programming and other community education services. And there the students get a very quick exposure to the reality of life in what is a very divided city. They then spend, so during the 2 years that they're in Making Links, they're at Switch at least twice a month. They spend 6 weeks after the summer of their first year of medical school in a northern Saskatchewan community, either the Métis communities of Isle La Crosse or Pinehouse, or on reserve at Buffalo River, Dene Nation, or Dillon. And during that time, they get involved in community-led, health-related development activities. They don't hang out in the hospital the whole time. In fact, they're only allowed near the doctors once a week. They have to spend their time in the community. And then their final experience is in an international setting. This year we have students going to Uganda, Vietnam, and we've been going to Mozambique now for 10 years. And the students, while they're there, it's about half of their time is in a clinical setting in the hospital, half of the time in community development work. And through these experiences, they get exposed in a meaningful way to a concept they learn about in the classroom, the determinants of health, but they get exposed to it in a totally different way than they would in a classroom. They interact with this concept in very personal ways through relationships. They experience the difficulty of, for example, you might see a story where a Métis elder from Isle La Crosse has to hitchhike to his cardiology appointment after an MI because there's no funding to help him with transit. Or in Dillon, we've got family members from the same family who, because they live just outside of reserve land, can't go to the clinic on reserve and have to drive 100 kilometers to see a doctor. See, those kinds of social determinants that get in the way of access. They'll see a similar thing happening in the inner city where even though somebody might live 2 blocks away from the hospital, we have a young woman recently who needed to go to hospital to be admitted for IV antibiotics for a chronic ulcer, but had no one to take care of her kids. So even though the hospital's right there, it was an impossible decision for her to make. Or they see the situation in Mozambique where we're in a rural community and there's a man who, we know he has HIV, but he hasn't been tested. His wife died of HIV. There's meds, free medications 30 kilometers away that might as well be on the moon for him because he doesn't have the money to go in regularly and get access to those medications, and there's no way to get them to him. So rather than learning about these concepts in a classroom, they learn about them in real life, and they're motivated to work to change those circumstances. And often what happens to them is what happened to me, and I think has happened to many of us who have become self-styled advocates, or as Richard accused me, politicians. We realize over time that, that concept, social determinants of health, it's very informative about what determines the outcomes for our patients, but it's also really frustrating because our jobs health services, that's number 10. It's way down the list in terms of what really makes an impact. So you realize after a while that Virsha was exactly right. Politics is medicine on a larger scale, and if we want better health outcomes, we have to be involved at that policy and political level. Where we should be heading is to a situation where politics actually reflects that, where health in all policies happens, where you have health considerations integrated into the decisions of ministries of employment, of citizenship and immigration, of Aboriginal affairs, of every ministry. Their outcomes should be measured based on not internally decided outcomes, but health outcomes. What are their decisions doing to improve the health and well-being of the people of Canada? This slide demonstrates what's happening in the current situation, because our current frame is that our decisions are judged based on really economic progress. So if you judge based on economic progress, hey, we're winning. The GDP is growing fantastically. If you judge based on health and well-being, that bottom line, the Canadian Index of Well-being, which is a set of measurements of health, social, education, other outcomes, has risen very little in the last 3 decades, despite great advances in economic growth in the country. So while politics maybe is medicine on a larger scale, currently it's malpractice. So we need a new frame. We need a new vision of what politics is about. And what I've been saying, and really my takeaway point for this talk and of the book and what I keep hammering away, is we need to shift our frame towards health as the primary outcome of how we decide at a public level our policy decisions. And I think it's really important to do that for a couple of reasons. One, because it appeals to people across the board, across the political spectrum. Health is something that matters to each and every one of us. So it's a frame that works. It's something that people care about. Our language is full of references: healthy debate, healthy economy, healthy relationships, healthy appetite. And we'll toast to each other's health. And that's reflected in polling. Always at or near the top of the list of issues of concern for people is health care. And we know that health care is what you do when people aren't healthy anymore, but it's a good surrogate for how important that is in people's lives. I think it's a useful frame because of the way that it'll reach people, but also, this is another, maybe if you don't like framing, some people have been talking about the idea of good ideas as social vaccines. If a bad idea is infectious, maybe a good idea is a social vaccine, something that when it's repeated enough, circulated enough, actually prevents bad ideas from getting hold. The other reason I like health as a frame is because it also gives us a map. We have this list. We know what makes the biggest difference in determining health outcomes, and each of these things maps directly onto activities of government. They're the social determinants of health, those that are impacted by public policy. So we have both a roadmap of where to go, but also a way to tell if we got there. Health is something we measure in great detail, morbidity, mortality, specific illnesses, to the point now where we can determine what, with sophisticated modeling, what the impact of a policy will be right down to the level of an individual. So we have a way to come back and really make that shift that we've been trying to make in the health professions towards evidence-based practice, make that same shift in policy and politics towards evidence-based policy. So I think one of the things that this makes us able to think about now is that concept of the social determinants of health, which often physicians respond to as kind of frustrating because, well, what do they do about it? Now we see that it actually does provide us a framework for action. It's also been a bit of a frustrating concept for many because while it's been widely known for decades, the Whitehall studies of the 70s, and really you can go back to the Greek medical philosophers and hear them talk about the social determinants of health in different words for that age. And yet it's still this concept that Dennis Raphael who's one of the major authors in this field, talks about it as being trapped in the phantom zone. And I know I'm dating myself by using an image from Superman 2 in 1982, but I grew up watching those on television. The phantom zone was where the bad guys wound up in a prison in another dimension, and you couldn't hear them. You knew they were there, but there was no connection to the rest of the world. And determinants of health, that concept has been thought to exist in a similar phantom zone where we know about it, we talk about it, but it doesn't actually influence action. And I think that's changing. And one of the things that gives me hope is the way that physicians are talking about it more and more in practical ways. This is a really interesting ebook out of the States called Upstream Doctors. And it talks about a group of physicians who started integrating into their practice more questions about housing status, nutrition, income, and working to intervene directly in their patients' lives, trying to advocate for them. On a local level, can we access a service for you? Can we go beyond what we usually see as physician work? And even at a community level saying, can we make sure that more services are available, that there's more, for example, affordable housing in our community? A very local example of this is the work of Gary Block and others, Health Providers Against Poverty here in Toronto, who developed the clinical screening tool for poverty, recognizing that if they're able to identify poverty, it changes how you think about the risk factors for your patients and how you screen them, but it also changes what you can do, because there are ways you can help them to access more income. So that's encouraging to me, but it's still, it's midstream. And actually, this is my cue for the video, if you will.
You're standing on the edge of a river. All of a sudden, a flailing, drowning child comes floating by. Without thinking, you dive in, grab the child, and swim to shore. Before you can recover, another child comes floating by. So you dive in and rescue her as well. Then another child drifts into sight. And another, and another. Eventually, hopefully, some wise person will ask, who keeps chucking these kids in the river? And they'll head upstream to find out. Every time we have to clean up an environmental disaster, every time a young person winds up in jail, every time people have to take medications to make up for the fact that they couldn't afford good food, we're suffering from the results of downstream thinking. Thinking upstream means making smarter decisions about what kind of country we want. What better goal could Canada have than creating the conditions for all people to enjoy true health and experience physical, mental, and social well-being? It's the best way to measure our success, and upstream thinking is the way we get there. Help us make the mainstream look upstream. Visit us at thinkupstream.net to find out more.
So that's a video that I'll talk a little bit about what Upstream is in a moment, that we produced to try and tell that story that Richard recounted. Before we had that video, I would often have to talk about that story. And so this, what you see in front of you, the placeholder slide, is actually my son, who's now 2.5, when he was 1, being the baby in the river. Just so you know, if you look closely, you can see a shadow under the water, which is his dad holding him up. We didn't just chuck him in. I'm sure his therapist will find it a fascinating story. Okay. Where did I go? Okay, great. So Upstream is a new national nonprofit organization that's really dedicated to identifying that new frame of health outcomes as the guide for political decisions and using the roadmap of the determinants of health to guide how that could be done, and using this language of upstream and that sort of founding myth of the babies in the river to try and connect that idea to people so that we can really change the landscape, stop doing malpractice and start doing medicine as politics as good medicine. If you look just up in the top right-hand corner there, the logo also sort of describes the 3 major elements of how we do that work. One is a think tank where we bring together experts, both advocates and academics, in different areas of the determinants of health to say what the problems are we're facing and what the most likely positive policy decisions would be. Then we work with different writers and artists in our story shop to put feelings on those facts, to connect the head to the heart so you actually have some motivation to follow through with that evidence that's guiding the decisions. And then lastly, we're building over time a strong community of individuals and organizations that are thinking along these lines, using this language, so that when there are new campaigns, like Cuts to Refugee Health, people are able to be quickly and nimbly motivated to be involved, but also consistently over time repointing us, correcting us back in that direction of making political decisions for the best in health. One example of doing this very recently is the Poverty Costs campaign in Saskatchewan, where we went for the evidence. We discovered that only Saskatchewan and BC didn't have poverty reduction strategies, and that the poverty in Saskatchewan was costing us nearly $4 billion a year to our economy. Then we launched a campaign called Poverty Costs, in which we shared those numbers, but also shared real first voice stories of people living in poverty, and directed all of that towards a very specific action and a very specific request of the provincial government that they implement a poverty reduction strategy, and got thousands of letters from citizens across Saskatchewan asking for the same thing. I don't get to tell the end of this story yet. I'm very excited to tell the end of it, but I don't know yet. We had a fantastic response from the media and the public, and a positive response from the government. So I'm hoping next time I give this presentation, I'll say that we won. But that's just mostly an example of how we operate and the kind of work that upstream informed thinking could achieve. But the last thing that I want to talk about is just, why am I doing this? I'm a frontline physician. Shouldn't I be seeing patients and not banging this upstream drum over and over? I think that many of us recognize that medicine is a very rewarding work. It's a very rewarding position to be able to help people in vulnerable times and times when they're ill, and in good times as well. But it's also very frustrating to write a prescription, order some tests, give some advice, and send people back out into the situation that made them ill in the first place, or just know that you're going to see person after person with the same problem. If we're going to have better health outcomes, we need social change. But that social change is impossible within a bad frame. So long as the terms of the argument at a national and local level don't allow for better ideas, then we won't get the social change we need to have better health outcomes. Oh, wrong button. All right. And so for my final slide, this is how you find out more about Upstream, making the links, or just track me down. Thank you very much for your time, and I know you'll enjoy hearing from Eric.
Thank you very much, Ryan, for vaccinating us with some great ideas. One of the things about being a doctor is that we are at the top of the public opinion poll, but as a politician, you're down at the bottom. So there are problems with advocacy, but it is still very much worthwhile, and it's something that we should be doing. Over lunch, I was watching the gifts from the elders, and the gentleman beside me was from the Congo and was saying that, this is the same way it is over in the Congo. And sometimes we think about third world countries over there as having their problems, and we forget that we have our own third world people here, our Aboriginal people, who have been taken over by us. They've been put off on reservations, reserves in North America. They have been put into residential schools. They have been subjugated to sexual abuse. As a result, they have the highest suicide rate. And so they really have been exploited and abused in our country. So it is with a great honor that we now call on Erica Lee, who has been advocating for her people in so many ways through the organization of Idle No More. Erica.
There's a big gap at the back of this stage, and it's dangerous. I don't know if this is a healthcare conference. Should be careful and make sure we don't fall back there, although there are lots of doctors, like Ryan was saying. My name is Erica Lee, and I'm a 23-year-old student at the University of Saskatchewan, and I'm here because of my work with Idle No More. As a student at the University of Saskatchewan, I should mention I'm a philosophy and political studies student, not a medical student, but hopefully some of my work is related. As a student at the University of Saskatchewan, I've done years of mentorship and retention work with Aboriginal students on campus. Within these capacities, I've watched as mining companies come into our campus and corporations gain increasing influence over our campus. Within my work with Idle No More and before that, as the daughter of a socially active single mother in inner city Saskatoon, I've been exposed to a lot of pain and suffering, but also to a lot of hope and joy. I feel strange identifying as an activist, as if the act of speaking up for human rights and environmental justice is unique enough that it requires taking on a whole new job title. I feel especially strange that identifying as an activist, especially since I'm 23 years old and there's people who have been doing this work for decades, for longer than I've been alive, who don't think of themselves as activists. How do I forward? Okay. So on November 10th, 2012, I spoke at the very first Idle No More gathering, or at least the first gathering with that name in Saskatoon. Around 100 people attended. It was a small group of the usual activists who show up at every event. I'm sure you are familiar with this. People will ask me what it was like to be at that event, if I knew it was about to become a major international movement. Unfortunately, the only thing I remember is this. I remember there was a solid 3 feet of snow on the ground, and even though I only lived 2 blocks away, I almost didn't make the trek through the alleyways to speak at the teach-in. Idle No More started in the winter, and Saskatchewan winters are notoriously fierce, but that didn't stop us. There were hundreds of actions across the world that winter. This is a picture of me when I was 10 years old. That picture is significant for me because it was taken at a time late in the summer, the first time I realized I wasn't white. It wasn't a discovery of my identity as a human being, but rather a realization that I was viewed as something less than, something deficient, something undesirable, and something unworthy of care. But let's go back for a minute. In November 1990, a few months after I was born, a 17-year-old Cree boy named Neil Stonechild was found frozen to death at the side of a highway outside of Saskatoon, where the police had apparently dropped him off in the middle of the night to walk off his intoxication in negative 30-degree weather. The practice is known as a starlight tour, and after multiple cases of Aboriginal men being subject to the same treatment, the police chief admitted that he knew starlight tours were a common practice and had been for decades. Although I was only a kid when inquests were taking place through the 90s and early 2000s, I remember one image vividly. This is a piece from Diana Thornycroft's series of People's History, which depicts the frozen body of Neil Stonechild lying in the snow surrounded by police. I remember clearly seeing the real-life, uncensored version of this videotape and photograph being shown repeatedly on the news, in the newspapers, everywhere, almost daily at times. Only recently did I realize the absolute inhumanity of this image flashing across the screen at dinner time, and how that image reflected the societal disregard for Indigenous people, and how that disregard for Indigenous people affected my self-worth as a young girl. Essentialist, one-sided stereotypes of Indigenous people, which are so common, these stereotypes that reduce us to caricatures, which strip our individual identities and ignore the real histories of our communities. These images that say we aren't humans, that we don't exist except as sports mascots. And I included in there the summary resolution from the American Psychological Association against the use of Aboriginal mascots. Around the age when that photo was taken that I showed you before, I remember I started to hate the way I looked. I was obviously just going through puberty, and that's a common thing for girls to hate themselves, to start to detest their bodies, but it's not something that should be so casually brushed aside, I think, anymore. It's not something that's healthy for young girls to start wishing that they looked like something different, wishing that they looked more like the images of Indigenous women that were presented in the media, because I'm never going to look like that unless I probably couldn't dye my hair even to that shade. So we see Disney's Pocahontas talking to trees and dancing in the wind, running through forests barefoot in tiny buckskin skirts. A sexualized object who was in reality about 11 years old when she met John Smith, still ripe and ready to be conquered. Just a few weeks ago in Saskatchewan, the Regina cheerleading team decided to have a Cowboys and Indians themed party. They took a cute picture with the girls pretending to be cowboys, pointing finger guns at the girls pretending to be Indians. We see the stories of missing and murdered Indigenous women, who the media tells us were leading high-risk lifestyles, and so really, is it any surprise they went missing? We see these women who are depicted as less than human, women who deserved respect and life and justice, but rarely find it. We see Attawapiskat. We see the dire living conditions of Indigenous people. How many of you have been on a First Nations reserve? Good amount. This is a photo of a boy who has developed a rash on his face and his body from the lack of clean water and sanitation at Attawapiskat. And right next door to Attawapiskat is the De Beers diamond mine, which in 2012 was responsible for a massive raw sewage spill onto Attawapiskat land that was not cleaned up. Canada is inflicting massive damage on a worldwide scale via our expansive mining industries. Unless you think that Canada is an exception, the populations most directly and permanently devastated worldwide by mining projects are Indigenous people. While this story was being covered, I remember hearing the comments, "Wow, why don't they clean themselves? They don't even bathe their children. Those dirty Indians." This dialogue gets into your head. When we hear these comments and see these images, it's easy to feel subordinate. So when I think back at that girl who was the person I was 12 years ago when that picture was taken, all of the anger and hopelessness inside of her and all of the self-abuse and confusion that would follow in the years to come, I wonder, what if there were different images for me to see growing up? What if we saw the times in Neil Stonechild's life when he was smiling instead of the times he was laying on the ground? What if we heard critical dialogue on the history of colonization and racism in Canada that leads to social and health problems that are all too common among Indigenous people? Idle No More exists to provide these images. Since that first rally, discussions of Idle No More have dominated the headlines in Canada and across the world. To those who have always been involved in the pursuit of Indigenous resistance, environmental activism, and the pursuit of social justice, the necessity is clear. Idle No More represents a turning point in our history in the sense that Indigenous issues are now being discussed openly and frequently in Canada. After generations of powerlessness, those most vulnerable in our society are refusing to remain silent regarding the denial of their most basic human rights. And quite simply, for the Indigenous women who lead it, Idle No More is not just activism, it's a fight for survival. These people that don't identify as activists because the idea of being anything but active is absurd. Because you know that beyond a doubt, the moment you stop fighting, pushing, resisting, you are no longer moving forward and you'll be crushed. But more than just fighting for survival, it's also a push to show that we want more than what the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben calls bare life. The basic necessities for survival. We deserve to thrive. As an Indigenous woman, waking up in the morning, going to school, leaving my house is a political act to me. Believing that I have a right to take up space. Actions with hundreds of people are beautiful, but Idle No More is about more than just the big rallies. It's about everyday resistance as well. So how many of you have been to the Chicago airport? Oh, a couple of you. So finding a sense of belonging is really hard sometimes when you're an Indigenous person, a woman of color, a woman, an immigrant or a refugee, queer, disabled, poor. If you struggle with mental health, HIV or AIDS, it's hard to find your place because so often you'll get the sense you're not welcome in certain places. So stepping off the plane and coming into this airport, I forgot that Chicago is the home of the Blackhawks depicting a stereotypical cartoon Native American warrior. So what is this silly little sign that probably got taken down like 30 seconds after I posted it up? It says "People, not mascots," in case you can't see. What does it have to do with Idle No More? It's about reclaiming spaces, about reminding people that Indigenous people are still here. We're more than cartoons, more than characters in John Wayne movies. Another important part about Idle No More for me was discussions of feminism, discussions of reproductive justice for Indigenous women, discussions of sexual health for Indigenous women and all Indigenous people. This is an Indigenous feminism project that we did, and we had influential people from all across the world take pictures with signs saying, "I'm an Indigenous feminist," or "I support Indigenous feminism." It helps to crush the idea that all Indigenous women are passive, receiving, not feminist, that feminism is not a traditional value, because to me it is. This is a picture from the Native Youth Sexual Health Network, an organization that Idle No More works with quite frequently, that supports interesting projects like making cute little cases for condoms and taking these to northern communities. It seems like such a small effort, but it really is addressing a massive problem. These are some children from Thunderchild First Nation, which is my father's reserve, during a flash mob round dance in Saskatoon. Even though I'm only 23, I've done a lot of activism. I've been to a lot of rallies. One of the different things about Idle No More is that at our gatherings there are children. There are babies and there are elders. This inclusion is crucial. I remember posting this picture and getting critics who would say, "They're too young, they don't understand what's going on, you're using them." Putting that sign in their hands is meaningless. I mentioned before how the negative images of Indigenous people I saw growing up affected me in bad ways. But thanks to my amazing mother, who is white but raised me on her own and made sure to give me access to my culture and take me to protests, I was one of those kids dragged along to meetings and rallies. I didn't understand the complexities of the issues at the time, but I understood that my body being in a space was a political statement. And my mom instilled from me from a very young age that the idea that if things are bad, you don't just accept it. You work to change it, and that's what these children will always know. This is Tennille Bear. She wore this hoodie that says "Got Land" on the back, "Thank an Indian," when she went to school. And she was told to take it off because it was offensive. This is in Saskatchewan. And when she didn't take it off, she was sent home. This small action kicked off a worldwide reaction, people coming out in support of Tennille. For simply wearing a shirt, she was attacked online. So if you go to idlenomore.ca/got_land right now, you can download your own stencil and make your own shirt. I've spent the past year listening to stories of people from across the world, and the more I hear, the less I feel the need to say. Because it's not only that the voices of marginalized people are absent or silent, it's that they've always been there and they've been silenced. So now more than anything, we need to learn to listen to those who are living the realities of gendered, racialized, and colonial violence. One of the most definitive images of Idle No More from my own personal experience is a photo we had sent in from Nazareth in Palestine. I remember this image well because I was exhausted from trying to balance schoolwork and everything else, and then someone posted it on the Idle No More page. The theme of this panel is marginalized populations, local to global, and I think this photo exemplifies that idea. Unity among those most vulnerable, not by ignoring difficult issues, but by working together to recognize that none of us are free while others are oppressed. It's crucial for immigrants, refugees, and Indigenous people to recognize that our oppressions are inextricably linked. Canada has become one of the wealthiest countries in the world by exploiting the land and resources access through the displacement and oppression of Indigenous peoples. If we're concerned about the land, water, air, animals, health, we can't excuse ignorance of Indigenous issues because these things cannot be separated. Justice cannot exist where we fail to acknowledge and correct the fundamental differences in worldview that have led to the situation we have today, where it seems like we cannot conceive of society without incredible inequity. In the span of the past year, I've been exposed to more wisdom, courage, love, and hope than I could have possibly expected in a lifetime. As someone who's been given the honor of carrying these stories with me, I hope today, now that I've shared a small bit of my experiences with you, you'll realize the urgency of the situation that has existed that is existing now at the doorsteps of everyday Canadians. And this situation has existed in the living rooms of Indigenous people and other vulnerable populations for decades. Thank you very much.
Miigwech. Thank you very much, Erica. You've just had, again, Erica calls herself a student, but I think that we are all students here. In medicine, we talk in the old days of continuing medical education. It's now, I think, the politically correct term is continuing professional development. So we are all students of lifelong learning, and certainly you have taught us a lot today, Erica. I'd like to now open it up for further discussion. Please ask questions, come to the mic, and please address our great panel. Juan Carlos.
Hi, the question is for Rashid. With regards to the June 16 events for this year, what are the changes this year as compared to since 2012?
In terms of the IFH policy? So, I mean, our first event actually took place before the policy was enacted. And so there was, I think the government's made two concessions. One more overt in that they removed government-assisted refugees off the table. The second was that, this is a bit confusing. We actually issued this in a press release and it was completely ignored because it's very subtle. But initially we were told that their insurance coverage would only apply to urgent and essential care. And we understood that to be very well circumscribed. And I think they backed off from that. What perhaps is the most significant change since the policy was announced is the Ontario government has announced a plan that has taken effect in January of this year, which will restore a certain amount, actually a fairly significant amount of the health coverage for refugees and refugee claimants in Ontario. So, you know, we certainly commend them on enacting this policy. It's a very complicated policy, and I don't know if on the ground it's going to work as well as they intended. And we hear there's a provincial election coming in Ontario now, apparently today, so be careful who you vote for.
Thomas Pickett?
Hi there, Thomas here. I'm just finishing up med school at McMaster. Thank you for the panel. That was wonderful to hear you all speak and to hear everything that you had to say. I just wanted to build off one thing Richard said, which was we are all students, and I think one of the themes throughout this conference is going to be advocacy, but I was wondering if each of you could talk about sort of from your experience as advocates, and you each wear very different hats, some of the skills in an advocate's toolkit maybe, and just some of the things that you think really are essential to sort of raising awareness to issues, and just from your own experiences. Thank you.
You know, I mean, what Erica said really resonated with me because I struggle with that term advocacy. I don't like to be called an advocate in some ways, and part of that is strategic because I think, you know, as a physician, we do have a tremendous amount of power, and I think as soon as you're cast as an advocate, some of that power is relinquished. I went to school at the University of Toronto, which actually faces Queen's Park, and I remember going to a number of rallies before medical school. But whilst I was there, and I was there every day in those days, and you'd look out, and every single day there's a protest at Queen's Park. You know, farmers for rain, farmers against rain, farmers, you know, it almost gets washed out. You know, for me, I think building alliances becomes really important when you're talking about social change. I think you have to be unrelenting in being exact about your facts. You know, and I think you also, for us as healthcare workers, you also actually have to be a very good physician, because I think if you're sloppy about your work, it's very easy to critique. But again, I think I share what Erica said. I mean, to me, you know, if you are seeing patients on a daily basis and you keep running into those same walls, it's hard not to take a step back and say, you know, if I'm writing prescriptions people can't fill, I mean, we're all wasting our time and wasting taxpayers' money, and you know, you have to then take that next step and try to figure out how to deal with that. So I don't think that's, you know, I don't think that's a profession, or I just think that's an inevitable extension of our work.
I'm a little more comfortable with you than you with the term advocacy, partly because I see it there in those CanMed's competencies as that's a real addition to our profession, that's become more and more recognized as an essential part of who we are. And I don't know, you need some word to describe it. Maybe it's not the perfect word, but I think it's helpful for us to kind of digest that's not something just the odd Meb Rashid does. It's something every one of us is expected to do. In terms of things that I think are helpful, one is being grounded in reality, in a community, in connection with people. I think it would be very hard for me to do the types of bigger picture work that I do if I didn't also spend time in a clinic with real patients who I know their names and their families and understand what they're going through in a relationship way that then you can speak with. You can use that voice that we have, and I think that's the other thing. You're just finishing medical school, you're off to residency, you already have a great deal of influence and power in society because of the letters behind your name. But when you use that in a way that's grounded to the reality of the communities you serve, you use that in a way that honors those issues. It's very easy to use it solely for your own advantage, but I believe that maintaining that connection is key.
I agree with what Ryan and Meb said. I think that staying in touch with, I guess, the reasons that inspired you to be active in the first place is really important. Because for me, being a student now, an upper year student at the university, it's really easy, I guess. When I had a professor tell me, once you step in the doors at university, you're middle class. So maybe that's not so much true anymore, but I still need to force myself to make sure that I'm doing work in my community, that I'm not speaking for someone unfairly, that I'm not, because I think that we should use our voices since they have power, we can use them. And it's important it's important to take responsibility for that, to the people that you're speaking for. And with regard to doctors, I think it's that video that Meb showed, I was just so excited and happy because, you see those kind of videos with Native people protesting and the cops coming in and you don't think anything of it. It's oh, there's a bunch of guys in lab coats and people are going to arrest them. So it's it's something different and it's something really powerful. So I think all doctors should be activists.
Again, Meg Witch, thank you very much, Erica and Ryan and Meb. I think myself that it's important to be an activist. Sometimes people will say, well, you shouldn't be speaking about nuclear power because, you're not a nuclear physicist. But we are doctors and we do know about health. And so I think speaking out on that is where we come from. And as we said this morning, we don't do it by ourselves, we do it as a team. And so you can call on the Gordon Edwards if you need a nuclear physicist, etc. So I strongly support the activism. Warren Bell.
I would 100% underline what Erica said. I think given responsibility and social standing demands that we exercise that responsibility and not sit on the sidelines and assume that we have a time to be complacent ever. But I wanted to specifically ask you, Erica, if you'd enlarge a bit on one very important power that exists within the First Nations community, and that is the nation-to-nation relationship that underlies much of what Idle No More has done and what it can do, and how you think that that is a unique lever to move some rather otherwise immovable objects in the political realm.
Sure. I want you to expand a little bit to sort of explain what specifically you'd like me to touch on.
Well, current projects in the Idle No More core group that involve making use of that unique and special power.
Okay. Yeah, the idea of nation to nation, I guess, is something that's really playing a role in my life, and I'm trying to figure out what my spot in it is, because just like the majority of the young First Nations population in Canada now, I grew up urban. I grew up in the middle of a city. So it's something that's so different from the experiences, I think, that even a few decades ago Aboriginal people had. So for me, I don't know, I've struggled frequently with whether or not I should call myself a Canadian, because my mom's a Canadian. I grew up in Canada, but I'm a First Nations person. So there's all these little identity politics, I guess, if you want to call it, that start popping themselves into your head when you're working on issues like this, where it feels like you're being directly pitted against like the government of Canada, and by default, like all of Canada. And that's something I think that I've realized, the government, to me, the government doesn't represent me, and if I consider myself a Canadian, and as many of my friends around me do consider themselves Canadians, I know that that government doesn't represent Canada. So, so yeah, I guess that there's all of these politics and divisions we have to overcome, and for the current projects of Idle No More that we're working on, it's just, it's all about making connections and working with groups there's so many groups that are actively fighting the Harper government and fighting the policies that are coming out right now, and we're not doing this alone, right? We don't have to rebuild something. There's a lot of stuff that's already there, so we just need to work together and find it. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, hi. I'm Jonathan Down, developmental pediatrician, and my question is for you, Ryan. It relates to a comment that you made about integrating health into all policy decisions. I think you were quoting somebody on that, but it relates also a little bit to the 7 generations phenomena. How do we have difficulty enough integrating health-based decisions into current frames of reference in terms of 4 years of tenure? How do we look forward 7 generations, particularly recognizing the epigenetic phenomena of transgenerational effects? So I'd like to hear all 3 of your comments on how do we integrate that element into the future, because I think it's a fairly important step, a transformational step, actually. Thanks.
There was I think he's left now, Dr. Shankardas was here earlier today, a Canadian researcher who was looking into how health in all policies is being integrated into different jurisdictions around the world, and it takes a different color in each place. Quebec is probably the area of Canada that's done the best. It's a model that looks a little bit different in each place. The best model would include the kind of considerations that you're putting forward, that we're looking not just for the health of the people who are in the room now, but the health of the people who are yet to show up for many years. One of the reasons I keep emphasizing the health frame, and it was interesting to hear Elizabeth May this morning talk about a very similar, come from a very similar place in her introductory comments, is that I think it opens up a lot of other conversations. That health outcomes, something that people value at a very personal level, can be an opening to discussions that can be very difficult to talk about. So climate change might turn somebody off right away, or nuclear power, debate over nuclear power might be of no interest to someone, but maybe you start with something closer to home with health outcomes that opens a door to a conversation that results in longer term thinking. Upstream, the whole concept is long-term thinking. It's making sure that we create the conditions for good health rather than dealing with the symptoms that arise because we failed to do so. So I think using upstream thinking and a health in all policies framework would be a good lead-in to exactly that approach.
Okay. Do you want to go first? Okay. I totally lost my train of thought.
I mean, the only thing I would add to what Ryan's saying is that, you know, I mean, I went to medical school 20 years ago, and sometimes when, I lose track of how dynamic sometimes our thinking is. So when I look at the slides Ryan put up there, there's a growing insurmountable amount of evidence now that speaks to social determinants of health. I think certainly as physicians, what we need to do is to emphasize that. So, even the OMA, the Ontario Medical Association, making statements around, air pollution. To me, I don't think that would have happened 20 years ago. And, I realize there's still many steps moving forward, but, I think part of it is grounding our advocacy and research, making sure we get the facts straight, and then making sure we vote for the right people.
I guess my comment to that would be that I agree it's important to look at the bigger structural problems that we're facing right now and the structures that our small actions feed into, and I think that's part of being a doctor is that you're on the front lines consistently dealing with these little things that are quite often products of bigger systematic problems, especially within Indigenous populations and vulnerable populations. So I guess, as Meb said earlier, taking a step back and recognizing the systematic problems you're dealing with is essential.
Thank you. Dr. Ben Chan.
This is a question for Erica. Thanks very much for your presentation. I work as part of a physician in the Sulukut system in a small reserve, New Slate Falls. I don't think there's anybody in the room that disagrees or in fact doesn't support what you're trying to accomplish and what the Idle No More movement wants to do. I think one of the challenges for people that are on the ground is that actually trying to make change, implementing things that seem really basic is incredibly complex, and everybody that wants to be part of that change, find barriers that it would make your head spin in terms of actually trying to think about different solutions to these seemingly intractable problems. So, in one sense, advocacy is great, but advocacy is easy compared to management in implementation. And from your perspective, as part of the Idle No More movement, what's beyond advocacy? Even if people were to give you, the powers and the self-government that you would want, what's the plan for actually implementing and driving change home?
That's a big question. I think that it's, like I said about, you're dealing with these massive problems. You take a step back and look at the massive problems you have to deal with. Like, I've worked with a lot of teachers, and I know the challenges are very different, but I think it's sort of the same in the sense that you're on the ground floor trying to deal with countless millions of people and all of these seemingly small problems that are connected to bigger problems, but you're not sure how to deal with the bigger problems. I think I was thinking about, as I mentioned in my piece, I've struggled with my mental health a lot, and it's something that's very common in First Nations communities, vulnerable populations. And for me, my doctor, who was actually an East Indian immigrant, I remember he's over years of being pushed around and people assuming, whatever, she's from a poor neighborhood, she's a Native girl, she's gonna have mental health problems. I had this one doctor finally who would take the time and sit down with me, and I remember him at one point telling me, would you be, if you had a heart problem, would you feel like you were dumb and weak for taking heart medication? I said, well, no. And he said, well, then you shouldn't feel dumb and weak for taking medication for your mental health, for looking after your mental health. So it's those little small interactions, even when you're dealing with massive problems, small interactions on a daily basis that can make a world of change for people. And I think doctors especially, and obviously you're totally stressed. You have very little time to see each patient if you're a GP or whatever. And so then that's where the advocacy work comes in, because if you're trying to micromanage and you're trying to deal with things on that individual level all the time, and meanwhile politicians are putting policies on you that you can't work around, you're not going to be able to get very far. So that's why activism is so important for people, I think, for physicians especially. Yeah. Anyone else?
Thank you. I'd like to call on our host, Leo Area.
Well, I realize that it's 6:01, so I probably shouldn't be asking a question, but if people don't mind. So I was thinking initially of Erica, but I think that we can, all of you could answer this. And this is going beyond the issues back to the whys and hows of your success. And I think that, of course, Meb presented a little bit about how physicians were able to speak, and perhaps we've got an idea why that was somewhat of a success. It didn't entirely change the government, but maybe Meb could also address this, but I don't know more. That could never have been predicted, I think, at the beginning, or it wouldn't have been with me. So I want to know why you think that was successful, but also because of you with your social media role, and Meb also connected with people. Ryan, in terms of engaging politically, also has that. I think all of you would be able to give some of us who have various issues that we work on just what you think are the whys and hows that made your issues achieve world attention.
I'll tell you if we're successful after the next federal election, actually, because our successes in some ways, I mean, we've certainly kept this issue alive, but there hasn't really been much that the federal government has given us to make me feel that it is a success. I think there have been a couple of successes. One is mobilizing physicians, and two, I would like to think that we've had some impact on this next generation of physicians. I mean, my colleague Philip Berger had a meeting yesterday with some early year medical students to help us plan the next day of action in Toronto, and there were 37 students. They've set up committees and subcommittees, and there's websites and the music and videos, and I think, you know, to see that type of mobilization amongst young physicians is to me quite inspiring. Why this issue has caught on in a way that other issues perhaps haven't amongst the medical community, I mean, it's hard for me to know. I still lean back to some of those issues that we targeted in my presentation. I think there's been tremendous leadership. I mean, I can't say enough for Philip Berger in Toronto and for the national organizations. I mean, that made a big difference because I think it took it out of the realm of advocates to mainstream, you know, traditionally very conservative organizations, and that provided us some cover in many ways. And I still think, you know, it's, for me, this is a no-brainer. Like, we've tried to, we've asked for public debate with the Minister of Citizenship because I think, you know, this policy is indefensible. And, you know, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, it's very hard to sit down and argue the merits of this policy. So in some ways, I feel like, you know, it's been a fairly easy position for us. We're really calling out something that, you know, with the slightest amount of scrutiny is shown to be, I mean, just bizarrely bad policy. So.
With regards to Idle No More, I think that people, you know, so many times people will ask, like, why was it so successful? What did you do? What are the exact steps I can follow to, like, create a movement? And that's not how it works, I guess. I think that with Idle No More, it was that the time was right. Like, there has always been resistance from physicians. There's always been resistance from Indigenous people, from marginalized communities. But I guess there comes a time when there's a groundswell and people start, I guess, recognizing that if we don't do something to turn things around, it's going to get really bad really fast, and it is, specifically regarding climate change and the direct health effects that it has on people. So I don't know, like, it's something that so many activists always struggle for, is that moment when your movement will explode, but it's something that isn't in the hands of one person or any kind of strategy. It's about, I guess, I think that Meb said something earlier about speaking rationally to the issues, and I think that, to me, that's been a big indicator, is that the more you talk about these things and force people to have dialogue about them, they can't ignore them anymore.
So I ran twice for leader of the New Democratic Party of Saskatchewan. The first time I got 46% of the vote. The second time I got 49.7% of the vote. Lost by 44 out of 10,000 votes. So I'm going to tell you how to fail. I'm pretty good at that. Although, joking aside, the secret of my almost success, I really do think, has been this. I shouldn't have even been on the ballot or of any interest to anyone. I was running against people who were elected, people with long track records in politics. And I was this out of nowhere young doctor. But coming out of medicine and talking about the frustrations of being a family doctor and how the desire for better health outcomes was a theme that really resonated with people. And I do think that finding that theme that fits your message, but also fits what people are willing to listen to and interested in, really matters. And that's why we're doing this work on trying to propagate that health outcomes and determinants of health frame. I think it was Ray Charles said something about there's nobody in the world can tell you what's going to be a hit. Many of you will know my friend Danielle Martin, who's suddenly a rock star because she got in a fight with the U.S. senator over healthcare. And she was amazing in that one moment. And I was talking to her, and she's, it's so weird to have been doing this for 12 years, banging that. I've said those same things to a lot of people, but I said it to that guy, and suddenly I'm a rock star. And I think the reason, though, is that she said it for 12 years, so that when the moment arose, and maybe, I know her mentors who said it for 50 years, so the grandmothers who said it for generations are perfectly happy that it's Erica Lee who's a rock star, and because they just knew that if they kept repeating it, eventually it would be a hit. So I think that may not be the recipe for instant success, but it's the recipe for long-term success.
Thank you all very, very much. Maybe we can have a big round of applause for our panelists. Now is the time for all of you to become outstanding people. You are now invited to go out and stand up and have hors d'oeuvres. I remind you that there's a book signing for Ryan Meili's book, A Healthy Society. Also, the Physicians for Global Survival's annual meeting is going to be at 6 o'clock in the Northern Spy Room, which is just across the way. So grab your hors d'oeuvres and then come across. You're all invited. And have a wonderful evening. And then at 7, of course, is the musical entertainment part of our evening. So have a wonderful evening. Enjoy being outstanding. Miigwech.